Hi, thanks for joining me. I'm Dr. Bettina Callary from Cape Breton University, and my co-authors on this presentation are Dr. Scott Rathwell from the University of Lethbridge and Dr. Brad Young from the University of Ottawa. And today I'll be talking about coach development and mental performance consultancy within masters sport. And I'd like to start by having you put yourselves in a translational headspace where we're going to be talking about research coming from coaching within the masters sport domain and thinking about how that applies to mental performance consultancy within the master's domain. I've been coaching for over 25 years, from grassroots through to Olympic levels, as well as master's sport. And I've also been in and around consultancy training within my degree, and I've been doing some consulting as well. And I see a lot of parallels within these two domains. And so this is something that I think that we can start to think about the research within coaching and how that could apply for mental performance. So when we're talking about masters sport, what we're talking about is a growing cohort of athletes who are typically over 35 years of age and extend all the way to 90 plus. They are formally registered in organized sport activities, and they acknowledge that they prepare ahead of competition. 70% of serious-minded masters athletes report having a coach, and this means that they're oftentimes training with a coach, so not necessarily all the time. When we look at specifically their psychological needs, they've been relatively neglected, and this is in part because of ageist assumptions about their competitive orientations. But masters athletes may be a highly competitive group competing at world and international events. Looking at mental training within masters sports specifically, there may be a treasure trove for mental performance consultants. Makepeace and Young have explored how applied sports psychology can support masters athletes through an extensive series of interviews with masters athletes and professional mental performance consultants. And what they found was that there were 4 different areas of mental training. The first was performance readiness, which largely was similar to other contexts. So having athletes develop goal setting, imagery, arousal regulation, concentration skills, and self-confidence. And then the other 3 were more specific to the adult context. So promoting sport adherence and an adult sporting lifestyle really connects with personal strategies such as justifying their sport participation, giving themselves permission to engage in sport, and sport commitment, as well as social strategies like effective communication and supportive relationships with others. In preserving sport enjoyment, the athletes were expressing gratitude for their sport involvement and reflecting on their experiences. And in addressing aging and self-compassion, the athletes were really, looking at self-kindness and at mindfulness. So Makepeace and Young suggests that coaches who are working with masters athletes can actually work on aspects of mental training, but can also then connect the masters athletes with MPCs. In the last slide, I talked about a quality sport experience. And in a coached context, what we're talking about in terms of a quality sport experience for masters athletes includes a number of different aspects. Throughout our research, we've noticed this pattern that describes how sport can be beneficial to masters athletes. And so this quality sport experience can mean different things. It can sometimes mean having fun or just getting out and enjoying one's sport. It can also mean that being an athlete is part of one's identity, and that the sport experiences help to reinforce that notion. And so a quality sport experience has many ties with masters athletes' psychological needs. And coaches should know and implement particular psychological approaches to effectively create quality sport experiences for masters athletes. So this brings us again to the purpose of this presentation, which is really to translate a synthesis of ongoing grant-funded research program in coached masters sport in order to uncover important considerations for MPCs when working with this sport context. And I do so by extracting the psychosocial themes from 15 separate data sets that were published between 2014 and 2020 regarding coached masters sport, and looking specifically at how those psychosocial themes are relevant for MPCs working within the masters context. And I'll start by saying that the definition of coaching from the International Sport Coaching Framework is that coaching is a relational activity, and that they have to understand, interact, and influence the people with whom they work. And so this ties in really nicely with the idea of mental performance and mental training. It also talks about coaching, coaches needing to take into account athletes' goals, their needs, and their stages of development. And when we look at stages of development, this arguably changes from one context to the next, so that what one would do with youth athletes may be different than what we do with masters athletes. So our research looked into what masters athletes want from their coaches, and they talked about things like having experience and sharing knowledge, fostering accountability to sport, displaying integrity, planning challenging practices, understanding personal preference for feedback, explaining the rationale for certain training activities, catering to different motives, tailoring the sport environment, guiding the athletes, and fostering self-determination. So we see a lot of links here with different psychological skills. Furthermore, what we see is that masters groups are highly heterogeneous. What this means is that within the masters group, the individuals have different motives, they have different competitive orientations, they have different personal characteristics, and they want to know they want their coaches to know when, how, and to whom to give feedback. So it's a very, very highly individualized process. Well, then we wanted to know what was different about coaching masters athletes, and coaches themselves noted things like that there's a very highly bidirectional communication that happens, wherein the athletes might ask questions or provide information to the coaches, and the coaches will also do that, where the athlete's maturity and their prior experiences need to be taken into account, where there is the need to personalize goals by getting to know the athlete's preferences, using multiple motivational strategies. Again, this relates to the heterogeneity of the group, providing greater opportunities for self-direction and autonomy, and understanding and utilizing masters athletes in various different roles and leadership. We then asked coaches where they learned these psychosocial skills to work with masters athletes, and they came up with a number of different ways in which they learn. Now, I'll note here that none of these coaches mentioned learning from MPCs. In fact, what we found was that there was an absence of messaging around the value of psychosocial skills in the masters context, and therefore, there's a lot of work that can be done here. So we created a tool for coach development where coaches can self-assess their adult-oriented sport coaching practices. And we called this the AASP. We have a coach version of this, as well as an athlete version of this, in which the athletes perceive what their coaches do. And this was validated with 467 masters athletes, as well as 383 masters coaches. And through exploratory structural equation modeling and confirmatory factor analyses, we came up with 5 different factors. And these are the 5 factors here. So these span across 22 different items. So taking what we learned, what I've just sort of explained of the research that we uncovered, I want you again to get into that translational headspace where you can start to think about how these factors might relate to your field. So the first one is considering the individuality of athletes. So this is where a coach considers and tailors their approach to each adult athlete's experiences and motives. The next one is framing the learning situation. This is when the coach frames the situation for the athletes through means such as self-discovery, problem-based scenarios, modeling, and assessments. The next is imparting coaching knowledge. This is where the coach enriches the learning environment by sharing their own relevant athletic experience, coaching knowledge, and professional coaching development. The next one is respecting preferences for effort, accountability, and feedback. And this is where the coach adapts their approach by considering how each adult athlete wishes to be held accountable for working hard and how they wish to receive feedback. And finally, creating personalized programming is when the coach considers and tailors aspects of scheduling, both practices and competition, as well as season-long programming to an adult's needs and abilities. In a sample of over 400 Masters athletes from 21 different sports, mostly in North America, we measured how Masters athletes perceived that their coaches who had a high frequency of using these adult-oriented coaching practices from the AASP, how this correlated to basic needs satisfaction, psychological needs thwarting, and perceived quality of the coach-athlete relationship. I'm going to focus our results as they relate to using all of the AASP factors conjointly, which is seen in the first column of this table. But you can also see other significant results highlighted in the table. So naturally, MPCs are interested in basic needs satisfaction and psychological needs thwarting. What we see is that when the AASP practices are frequently used, Masters athletes report a negative relationship to needs thwarting, both autonomy and competence. And then a positive correlation to basic needs satisfaction, including relatedness, autonomy, and competence. Thus, MPCs might consider using adult-oriented practices that match the AASP factors when working with MA or when working with Masters athletes to bolster their basic needs satisfaction. Or MPCs can use this information to help coaches understand the psychology of effectively coaching Masters athletes. Other things to consider are the interpersonal relationship with your clients. Our data indicates that when Masters athletes feel that their coaches are frequently using adult-oriented practices, they also have a close, committed, and complementary relationship. Thus, MPCs might also strive to have such relationships with their clients by using the AASP factors, or they can help Masters athletes and coaches develop stronger relationships by using the AASP. Finally, MPCs might consider whether Masters athletes like their sport and want to continue playing by asking them about how their training environment applies adult-oriented practices. We also conducted, used the AASP in interventions or workshops with coaches, and they reported having perceived success with their teams. Thus, we suggest that the AASP can be used by MPCs when creating interventions and working with Masters participants. So translating this research from the psychology of coaching to mental performance contexts may help MPCs expand their reach and effectively meet adult client needs. These approaches might be useful for MPCs in tailoring their approaches to Masters athletes, but it might also provide the ability to discuss these concepts with coaches as alternative and effective ways to work with Masters. The full AASP is available by registering with the Coaching Masters Athletes Research Network on our website, which I'll show you in a moment. Or you can soon buy our book, Coaching Masters Athletes, which includes the full details of the AASP development and our information specific to mental performance consultancy. So thank you very much for your attention, and I hope you enjoyed the presentation.